3, 2. Hi, everyone. This is Paul Casey, the Kenpo Karate Hall of Fame educational video series, where we discuss issues relating to American Kenpo and the other systems that fall within Kenpo, also the influences of Kenpo. And today we're really lucky to have two men that are experts in their field of American Kenpo, as well as other mixed martial arts. So first of all, we have Dennis Conatser. Mr. Conatser studied originally under Steve LaBounty in the Tracy system. Later on, he moved over to Mr. Parker, the founding Grandmaster of the American Kenpo, and was with him until Mr. Parker's death in 1990. The last 12 years of Mr. Parker's life, Dennis was a constant participation in educational teachings, private lessons, seminars, and things like that, and has come to understand very well the depth of Mr. Parker's teaching through his writings. We'll be exploring some of them today. Also with us today, we have Master of the Arts in American Kenpo, Marty Zaninovich. Mr. Zaninovich originally started with also the Tracy system under Steve LaBounty. From there, he has gravitated over and been a longtime student of Senior Master of the Arts, Richard Huck Planis. But Mr. Zaninovich's level of expertise in education has not just been limited to that of American Kenpo. He has also been a student for many, many years, I believe 20 years, at Danny Inosanto's Academy. In that, he is a certified Jeet Kune Do instructor, as well as a student of many other arts that Mr. Inosanto teaches there. So, welcome, gentlemen, to the Kenpo Karate Hall of Fame.
Hi, Paul. Pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you both. I really appreciate that you're coming on here. This discussion today is going to be the merits of American Kenpo, the law of the fist, and Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. And we'll be asking ourselves, what is similar, what is different? We'll contrast, compare. We'll show where these men were working toward their journey of the martial arts. And I'm going to reference several books, so I'm going to pull them up right now. With Ed Parker, throughout this series, it's going to be a multi-series, I'll be talking about Mr. Parker's books. His first writing was Kenpo Karate, The Law of the Fist and the Empty Hand, came out in 1960. One of the most desirable collectible pieces of martial arts literature. If you get a chance to find this in original copy, grab it. Otherwise, there are plenty of reprintings of that book. The second book that we'll look at, also for Mr. Parker, is The Secrets of Chinese Karate. And this came out in '63. Again, a nice addition to the Parker initial writings. I also will use later on references from Mr. Parker, which will also cross over to the philosophical side of Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do, and that will be the Zen of Kenpo. These are actual quotes by Mr. Parker as he talks about the martial arts. I've used these before in the past as reference to establish foundation, so we have a basis to drive from. The last thing will be, which is a part of a very important part of the latter part of his life. Dennis was involved with that, and that was the Infinite Insight series, okay, from volumes 1 through 5. There is so much to derive from this. Now, mind you, these were publications that were printed during Mr. Parker's life. So he authorized these, he authored them, he made sure that what was in there was important so that his art would always be remembered. The books that I will be using for Mr. Lee will be two books that are very famous. People collect these all the time. The one is the Tao of Jeet Kune Do, which came out after his death. I want to say 74, 75, something like that. I might be wrong on that. And the other book that came out was called Bruce Lee's Fighting Method. Now, both these books were subsequent to his passing. With a book before that, and that book simply was a publication in the 60s, and that was called, if I can get this correctly, Chinese Kung Fu, The Philosophical Art of Self-Defense. Okay, and that book there you can see is a very interesting, if I can pull it up here, there you go. And again, these are references. These are Mr. Lee's thoughts and how he came up with his system. And we will talk in more at length at that with Master Marty. And I'm just going to reference you as Marty and you as Dennis today, okay? Because I think that's more appropriate, though, out of respect to both of you. I want you to know that we will conclude with that later on. But it was also a Parker way of handling how he was in the school. He would always refer to first name on people. So that's really important. So in the reference for both of these men is The Art of War, The Art of War by Sun Tzu, and The Book of Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi. Now, these books are important because these have been around for a long, long time. Obviously, The Art of War has been over 2,500 years, and The Book of Five Rings has been at least 500 years. So they have a lot of validity because they're proven, thoughts in warfare as both these other gentlemen have used. So it's important there. There's other books that, that I think that will deal with the second half of our discussions, and that will be when we're talking to about Bruce Lee's philosophical side of his life, where he would talk about the things that motivate him, and which is so integral in his system of Jeet Kune Do. It wasn't just limited to a physical training of how to, work in the martial arts, but more of a why and the importance of doing things like that. And I think the one of the list of books that I have here, some of the books that Mr. Lee liked to read would be the works of Jiddu Krishnamurti, whom was one of the more important influences. Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, The Way of It, the Book of Five Rings, as I mentioned, the works of Alan Watts. He also looked at the Analects of Confucius, The Art of War, as we mentioned, and The Soul of the Samurai. Now, I was talking to Edmund the other day, and he was telling me some of his father was very big on Tony Robbins. Is that his correct name? Is that the right name? Tony Robbins?
Tony Robbins.
Yeah, okay.
Anthony
So
Robbins.
he's big on Tony Robbins and a few of the others. So, again, I believe in positive messages all the time. I believe one of the things that's really important, and we've discussed this between the three of us, it's better to focus on our strengths and look at our weaknesses within our strengths than just focus on our weaknesses. So I think we should need to look at a collective effort there, and that will help us improve. So enough with my talking. Let's get into this. Obviously, I will let you two be the spokesperson based on your personal opinion, experience, training in each of these particular arts. All right, Dennis, give us some background on Mr. Parker's American Kenpo.
Well, Mr. Parker, through his evolution, after college, during college, he started teaching a little bit in Utah, and that kind of started him on the way. And then, of course, he evolved down to Pasadena, where he really made his, life's works, going from his life down there. And during that time, he evolved, creating what eventually morphed from just Kenpo to American Kenpo, which is anytime you say American Kenpo, you kind of denote the roots of Ed Parker, who was the founder of that system, the one and only founder of American Kenpo. There are many offshoots of American Kenpo today, and or just plain Kenpo today as well as Kaji Kenpo, some of the sister systems and so on and so forth. But Mr. Parker was very organized in his methodology. It wasn't a start and finish right away. It was a constant evolution. So he started with things, and something came up, he added to the system, reorganized it. In fact, just prior to his death, he was, still reorganizing through the 80s, more or less kind of what I would consider sort of I never want to use the word final or complete, but a more completed version than through the 60s and 70s. And he was, at that point, evolving to such a capacity where he had a lot of things set in place, let's put it that way. Not set in stone, but set in place, such as many of his philosophies, such as written in the books, such as the 3 Points of View, his analytical study of motion. He was oftentimes referred to, I think Kung Fu Magazine or Black Belt, one or the other, referred to him as the magician of motion. Obviously, everybody uses motion, no matter who it is. So it's just a matter of their interpretation or their usage and how they apply it, depending on the individual of motion. We're all in motion, obviously. And plus, he had things like he developed things like the zone concepts, the web of knowledge, which was a breakdown of all the basic types of attacks we can potentially experience, and such. Excuse me. And then from there, he created a system of hypothetical scenarios for grabs, pushes, punches, kicks, etc. The various attacks, and in a possible scenario of what you could possibly do if attacked this way. Now we all know that you're not going to be attacked. The answer is not going to be the same every time, and in fact, the result of the technique may not work exactly that way. But it was a training drill to teach you, much like in boxing. They do various drills, and then when you're out there actually fighting, you got to be able to draw from those drills. And I think that's pretty much a standard for everybody for the most part.
On the foundation of Ed Parker, which you're talking about, we'll get to that in a second. Marty, tell us about JKD, the roots of it, and how it evolved to where you're at now.
Well, there's four levels of starting that we look at from that. It started out when Bruce Lee was originally in China and then moved over here. You had the Seattle portion of it, you had the Oakland, and we had the last part of it in Los Angeles. Bruce Lee's core was Wing Chun, and then he evolved from that. He was always heavy into dancing, which gave him the fluidity. He also was enamored with boxing, Western boxing, and his brother, which is not talked about much, was a champion fencer. So he added a lot of that concepts into his thought process. Bruce Lee was always one not to get bound by a system or a series of techniques that had to be followed. He was more of a free-spirited, and I'm speaking more from my education with Guru Dan Asano. We've always been able to learn how to be fluid in our motion and to read energy and flow from that. And it was never been a set in stone set of techniques or forms like we do have in Kenpo. But we do utilize some of the same type of footwork in the JKD system. It was originally called Jun Fan Kung Fu, which that was Bruce Lee's name. It was Lee Jun Fan. And then he evolved it to Jeet Kune Do, after that.
Okay, I looked up some information on it because it seems to be that in the JKD theme, there's basically two parts. There's the physical and the philosophical, which is very important to him. Obviously, having an Eastern mindset, and we dealt with some of the books that he references to. He looks at it as fundamentals being the simplistic, direct way of dealing with it, with the dominant, strong side. The best defense was a strong offense to avoid telegraphing your attacks. His principles were simplicity and directness, the freedom to deal with real combat, not hypothetical, what we would say tournament type of fighting. He was more about real life in the principles. And then he also applied that, which later on goes to his other side of his of JKD, that he will use that to challenge himself in life. There's a battle, as I referenced once before, Trejo told me, Frank Trejo said to me, he said, Pablo, there's two battles in this world. There's the one in your head and there's one in the ring. And so I think Bruce's idea was that to make sure you got right in the head, you better be thinking there, analyzing it. And therefore his philosophical side came out. And as you said, he had Wing Chun. That was his martial arts. He also had the use of Western boxing, which he obviously adapted in him. One of the things that was very interesting is that he kept a notebook, a 2x3 notebook with him to write thoughts. And in my discussion with Dennis, Parker did the same thing. So I'm curious if they both pulled out their little books or they suggested it to each other. The little black book had names in it, but it was mostly names of martial arts ideas, not what other people use them for. Another thing that was very interesting was the word of flow. Flow. Now, if you look at, Lao Tzu, and you can see a heavy reference there to a lot of the statements that Bruce would use. It was very interesting that he would bring that in with the flow relating to water. Okay, and obviously you can address that better than I. But it would seem to me the adapting of the system to what is needed. In other words, he wasn't a conformist. He was trying to be himself, and he used to say this a lot. Free expression is one of the most difficult things to accomplish because our society requires us to conform to the ways that society wants you to be. In other words, if you want to be successful, you have to go to school. You have to get a degree. You have to get a job. You have to do all the things that society thinks is correct, where somebody like this man is creating, as well as Ed Parker. Now, what is your thoughts on that, Marty, about the flow?
Well, I've always been enamored with the flow because I love the way the reading of the energy, and Kenpo is no different. And this is just my analogy of it. And Dennis, you can chime in anytime. My analogy of this with the JKD, we have the ability to really take what's coming, and we anticipate. I shouldn't say anticipate. We react to the energy that's being flowing, and that's the intercepting of it. Bruce Lee was always one to fight more southpaw than not. He was a left-hander, but his idea was keep the strong side forward and keep your power there, where we tend to go and gravitate the other way. The one downside on that is you're leaving your inner thighs open for those low kicks to come in, and you're not going to take too many of those. But what I believe with the flow is they're letting you explore, and this is based on my learnings from the Inasano Academy from Guru Dan. As the strikes come in, he allows you to parry and strike at the same time, which we do the same. They utilize a lot of different type blocking. They weren't real big on doing a block per se, although they will use them. But there's more fluidity to redirect the energy and to move your body around to sometimes fight with no fight, like he would state.
Okay. Dennis, Parker's structure is foundational, so therefore you have a basis to learn from. Common sense. I mean, until you fall down, you don't know what it's like to fall down. You don't know what it's like to have a burnt finger until you touch something hot. So there is some experience there in the idea. My analysis between the two is I find that we're both the same. We're more similar than different, but that's just an objective observation, my opinion. But I don't have JKD training. I didn't spend any time with Marty or at the academy. I've always been a American Kenpo student, but the Hall of Fame has given me the ability to be exposed to many other ideas. And even within the Kenpo world, there are so many different ideas there. I mean, you look at that and you start to contrast and compare. So Parker, coming from the islands of Hawaii, obviously he was introduced to Western boxing. He did well in that. He had some judo background, which is grappling. Then he met Emperado, and he was trained with him as well as under Chow. Now, from that, he evolved. So he's had a true basis for his martial arts experience. He comes to America, he starts to go through this process of what's going to work in the American Western setting, different than that of, say, the islands of Hawaii. I think of it as if you and I and Marty all go to the buffet Depends on what buffet we're going to. Are we going to go to a Chinese buffet, an Italian buffet, an American buffet? Or are we going to go to, say, one that has all different cuisines from the world? And you'll have Mexican, Mediterranean. Then you also offer different things like desserts and salads and drinks and things. I believe, in my opinion, and this is not derogatory, this is an objective thing. I think Ed Parker created the ultimate martial arts buffet, taking the best of what he found to work as general principles of motion and rules. Marty can address that better within that because he learns that from, Senior Master Arts Planus and what can be utilized. But on the other hand, Marty can also look at it from the JKD viewpoint of what will work for that of the student. Now, they both have two famous quotes. Marty can probably address the first one, and Dennis can address the second one. Marty, what is that quote I'm looking for?
Good. Thanks, Paul. I don't know which quote you're looking for, but
Or I'm looking for what essentially you see at the academy on the wall.
What I see over at the academy, it's always been an environment of free expression, and the idea is to be able to bring out the best in each individual through that self-expression, because nobody's going to move exactly like another person, nor can they follow that same inherent ability that person has.
The quote I was looking for was, research your own experience, absorb what is useful, reject what is useless, add what is specifically your own. That's the quote I was looking for. Okay, and it's on the wall there at the academy. Obviously, there's a reason for that. Dennis, what is Mr. Parker's response to that?
Boy, like, put us on the spot, will you?
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, you could have given us a little heads up.
Yeah, there's only a million things.
You give him a right cross, I'm going to give him a left hook.
Well, what was related to that of being useful?
Well, Mr. Parker came up with the thing with a couple of them, but one is what's useful, unuseful, or useless. And so he would kind of categorize those things, looking at your movements and so on and so forth, as far as evaluation.
I see similarities. It's just a different use of a word, but the intent and the purpose of those statements were pretty much the same. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, I think with the Inosanto thought process, he's evolved also. I mean, what you see on the wall was good then, and I think, and I really have to believe that his evolution in life, and he's always been one to say you recreate yourself every 5 years. I do believe when he comes up and we're working out, and by the way, we're in the parking lot now too, so I don't see the inside all the time to refresh my memory. But what he always states is, I could show you how to go through this, but I want you to discover and I want you to explore there throughout that technique and the different energies that are coming at you to get a fluid response and then let your own self-expression come out. So it's basically what you're stating, yes, in a different set of words, but that's one of the philosophies that he does really strive to do, is to keep that self-expression to be your own and coin it yours.
Well, I think it's funny you say that because there's a quote from him that he said, I reference this from Bruce. Bruce used to say, know the principle, follow the principle, dissolve the principle.
Dissolve the principle, absolutely.
And I think that also overlaps into the useful, unuseful, and useless concept but that's conclusionary on Ed's point of view, because he said, he's adapting at the end, but he doesn't discard it. I think, and the reason he doesn't discard the last one, because in his mind, that learning experience is something he might want to remember so he doesn't commit that same mistake, which could be fatal at a later date. Or it could be the use of, as he thinks, of tools in his Kenpo toolbox. Go ahead, Marty.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's the old adage, and I think Bruce Lee coined it right, and I may get it wrong, but he said one to know tradition is to fall back into a comfort zone. And that's the old way of thinking. The new way of thinking would be to explore and to go out and adapt to the new. And I think that's always the challenge that takes place, because we do revert to what we know and what we're comfortable in. And it's a tough answer to come up with a lot of times when you're in that situation and you have to go with the flow instead of forcing it. We end up a lot of times chasing a technique. And I think that was one of the adages where Bruce Lee wanted to keep you away from getting set into that pattern. And like you said earlier, let it dissolve.
Well, when
Right.
you go to Dennis, now go ahead. I'm sorry, Dennis, go ahead.
Well, yeah, like that, like what Marty said. Mr. Parker had a saying. It's kind of similar to what you're saying in his saying was, one is bound, one is compelled to tradition, yet knowledge is endless when tradition is bound. And so, you know, there's a traditional way and a way that actually works. So you don't want to be bound by tradition. You want to be open to change and to adaptation. That's more or less what Marty's saying. You know, I think, and Mr. Parker had that way of saying that particular phrase, but basically that's what he's talking about. We have, Mr. Parker developed a system, you know, from which to teach beginners, and not just one beginner, but kind of a broad spectrum of people. Yet the reality is, when you go to application, you're not using that entire system. You're using what you can do. Not everybody can be a jump kicker. Not everybody can be a power puncher. So you got to be able to use what's, you know, fit or useful to yourself, even though the system may have whatever. And that was bent more on actually the business of teaching versus the business of personal adaptation. I think Bruce goes more to actual personal adaptation.
Well, that's his strength. That's the person. I'm going to quote something real quick, and then I'm going to let Marty jump on it. One of the quotes that Bruce came up with, which is very simplistic, very direct. There's, again, applying the 3 points of view, actually. And he likes number 3 a lot. So he says there's 3 types of ideas, which is important because that means he's a thinking martial artist. That is something that Mr. Parker strongly made sure that we would follow. He wanted us to be thinkers, not just to be robots. When you have no basis, you have to have some kind of foundation. These 2 men obviously had some foundation, and their journey brought them up to where they realized, aha, what is going to be more personalized for me? Parker allowed you to personalize it. That made it your style. Bruce Lee decided, he came up with his ideas, his training system, which was a personalized, not only style, but there was no style, but was more of a way of life, which was free thinking. So he had this to say. The 3 types of ideas are: initiate ideas. In other words, think, come up with something out of here. But how will you be able to come up with something if you don't have some kind of experience or some kind of guidance? 2, adventitious ideas. In other words, ideas that come from other people. I'm listening to both of you gentlemen. You're going to make me think outside of Paul Casey's mindset. Maybe there's something here I'm not seeing, the other point of view. And then the last one is the fictitious idea, which one invents, which sort of sounds like the first one. You know, initiate an idea, but aren't you at the same inventing an idea? I think that's the creative side. So I'm going to let Marty address this question. Is JKD, Jeet Kune Do, a system, or is it a way of life?
Great question. You know, it's more of a way of life, I believe. You know, it was always had its root intent to be more of a street type fighting art. You don't see JKD champions around. You know, you go to tournaments and you don't hear them, you know, in the forefront of that. Their training style is a little bit different on that, and theirs is to be effective, to do and utilize what's going to end that confrontation immediately. There's a process that you can learn the JKD. It does have some core values to it that you'll follow, but it's not as structured as we do have in Kenpo. Kenpo is an extremely structured system, but with that being said, with the core values that come from the JKD, and that goes back to the Wing Chun, the Western boxing, and the fencing, and then a mirage of other arts that have influenced it, I think from what I see and what I've experienced, I believe Inosanto helped organize Bruce Lee's thought process in his structuring of the JKD, and I think he had a lot to do with it. I know when going through some of the JKD moves, our footwork that we have in JKD is similar to our Kenpo. So I think from what I can see and what I've gained on knowledge, it's more of a free flowing, free spirited type of influence that allows you to have your own self-expression. And if you learn how to deflect off a right straight punch coming in, you'll start learning how to adapt to it. We're utilizing the same motions, a lot of them that we use in Kenpo. How we do apply them are a little bit different. And with that being said, that comes with the non-structured environment that does come with the JKD environment.
Bruce, actually, you mentioned, you referenced Wing Chun, fencing, boxing, and then later on he evolved into using grappling arts, fencing that you said was from before, and whatnot. He was always like a sponge looking to see what was out there that could actually enhance him. So he really wasn't structured. He was just going to the buffet of martial arts and choosing those that he felt would enhance himself, correct?
I believe that to be true. And I believe when you say enhance himself, I believe, and this is from, more I want to say the Inosanto method of interpreting, Bruce Lee's teaching, which he's kept as pure as he could with the curriculum that's given forth, with still a fluid boundary to it. I do believe that Lee wanted his people to really be effective in a street confrontation, along with enhancing his own personal skills as he grew. But he was one, to my understanding, that would want to bring you up to a higher level along with him.
He got his training. He also trained a lot with Mr. Inosanto, who was an Ed Parker black belt, correct?
Absolutely correct.
So
and
there had to be a lot of influence from Mr. Inosanto regarding the idea of how Ed Parker addressed, the principles of motion, as you probably have addressed with Mr. Planets. But those fighting system,
Absolutely.
Parker, we'll go to right now to Dennis. Dennis, let's talk about that. Why did Parker like the right side forward and the closed stances and the hands in a fighting position? Give us why he went that route with it.
Well, I think you went that route based on numbers. Most people are right-handed, and so most Western boxing was left foot forward because their strong hand was pretty much back. The right foot forward was a little different. I mean, in karate, it's a little different because we have kicks. Boxing, there was no kicks, so there was no need for a strong right foot forward. You wanted a right foot back for a base and a push off, to advance. So there were some similarities there. So I think his was just a matter of numbers of what is more useful for most people, not singling out things. Obviously, the questions come up, what about left-handed people? In Kenpo, when it was pretty much a right-handed art as a base, the base material was pretty much developed right-handed because Ed Parker was right-handed, and so that's why we oftentimes, train symmetrically. We do both sides, so you become a little bit freer because you never know, you might have a situation where maybe your right hand or your right leg or whatever is injured, and you might need to use the other one, and it needs to be equally coordinated. Just like in weightlifting, you don't just do curls with the right arm. You have to do symmetry and develop both sides. And so, but go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to go to Marty on this. Marty, obviously Bruce's foundation was, besides a little bit of Western boxing, I don't know how in depth that was. I know he was a champion over. He gravitated to Wing Chun with Yip Man. correct?
Well, I think that's what his start was with the Wing
Okay.
Chun, so that's where he evolved from there. And then the Western boxing came in after.
Oh, came in
Um,
after. Okay, because I was going to ask him, isn't predominantly in the Wing Chun, it is the training is from face to face in a horse type stance, and you're sort of open to your opponent, but most of the training is usually hand kind of principles, motion of defenses, trapping. I'm not sure, so I'm going to let you explore
yeah,
that for us.
yeah, I like the way Dennis gave the analogy of the Kenpo and the way it was structured there. And I totally agree wholeheartedly. With the Bruce Lee system, he was more an advocate of doing a southpaw. If you look in history and the writings of it, the southpaw, it seems to be a more winning stance, per se, and that's just based on what I've read. Um, Now, with his thought process, going back to the Wing Chun question, it's a straight-on type of art where they control the center line of your opponent. The firm belief is that Bruce Lee had, the most part of what we think about is our own self understanding. When we start understanding of ourself, our art, when we start looking at an opponent, we're really not in tune with that person as well as we should be. And that's a weakness that needs to be strengthened. So going back to the right side forward, there are kicks, and it's similar to Kenpo. Their belief is, belt level and below, that's where your strength is at. The Bruce Lee adage was, go right side forward and, keep your strong sign for a faster, more direct answer to the problem, is where their thought process was with that structure. So you're getting more of that side. Now, the Inosanto method was always what Dennis stated too, be symmetrical on both sides. So he makes us go through and become as proficient as we are able to be on both sides. So we do have that, self-expression and that understanding of how to operate, from both stances.
I'm going to go back to this in a second, but I'm going to a quick quote on you were saying about self-expression. He said here, he goes, "Be true to yourself. All knowledge is eventually self-knowledge in the wisdom." So, do you believe, his background in Wing Chun? Do you believe he sort of revisit the Wing Chun system when he was with Danny Inosanto, and then said, "I will not use this portion of Wing Chun, but I will keep it as part of my training and incorporate the Kenpo movement, which involves a lot of the same fighting stances that we see in boxing, and try to sort of mix them together, becoming his own self-expression."
I believe there's a lot of truth to that, and it's the old saying with truth. What is truth? First, it's ridicule. Next, you really challenge it and oppose it, and then after that, the third level of it is a total understanding, and you see the result of it, and that becomes that truth of that moment, which is actually history that's been written. I do believe with Bruce Lee's core value of being the Wing Chun when he was there doing it, I think his ability to discern of what was going to work and what was not going to work and how to evolve, really made a difference. And it's the same kicking, it's the same punching, but I believe it's what we talked earlier. And I love the way Inosanto has coined this. Guru Dan's always stated, in order to make and let yourself evolve to express yourself, it's like looking at music. It's the same music, but how's it conveyed? First it comes out in a vinyl record, then it came to a cassette, then it came to a CD, and then after that's MP3 where you download it. And what happens in that same basis, from that core value, your structure is going to eventually open up to adapt to new possibilities and new motions around. Before, it was more of a traditional type art that they were learning and doing, back in the 50s, 60s, and that was before my time. But as I see when it starts coming forward, Bruce Lee was one that could have been coined the mixed martial artist, guru to start with, because of his interest in bringing on what is going to work and what's going to be beneficial in a more realistic type situation.
Now that came to be his ideas were presented at the International Karate Championships in Long Beach. I mean, he had obviously appeared before that, but he was probably looked as an outsider, which is what Ed Parker was also thought of. Am I correct there, Dennis?
Yeah, I think there's similarities in their onslaught when they first came on the scenes. I think that's fair to say. You know, they both had interesting evolutions. In my opinion, Ed Parker was more organized in his structure, mainly because he was addressing the business aspect, and there were certain things that were necessary for business to sell. Bruce was obviously much smaller on that thing, although he, I believe, wanted to open more studios and had a dream of, potentially having, many Jeet Kune Do, affiliates and so on and so forth. But he hadn't evolved at that time. He was still, I think, personally evolving more with Jeet Kune Do than Mr. Parker had pretty much set stuff down, and he was developing the business as well as continually developing himself and the art as well. Marty mentioned something earlier, about we were talking about the Wing Chun centerline structure. Mr. Parker then, of course, out of this thing, one of the things he developed was the various zones, and in terms of the width zones, Mr. Parker had basically 4. But the thing is too, in terms of use what's useful and whatever, another factor is what I call reading your opponent. And Mr. Parker and I were talking, and when you read your opponent, when you understand motion, you look at a particular posture and you study a person and you know what he likes to do, you can start kind of predicting, or what he called, he had a factor for every bit of the alphabet. He had an A letter, B, all the way to Z. And, there were different, terms for each one of those letters. Well, the X, I go, well, gee, what's X? And he goes, it stands for X-ray eyes. And that's where you can actually look at your opponent and read his motions, which you're able to forecast more or less what he's doing. And that's a skill in itself. And I think Bruce himself, I think that's something he really looked at, was looking at what's his opponent doing, and then he evaluates what could he counter, or where's the opening based on what he was being given.
I'm going to stop right now. I'll let you guys talk between yourself for about 3 or 4 minutes. I have to address an issue with Georgie. Okay, I'll be right back.
The George fan.
The George fan. Yeah, I've got the Tyson fan in the other room. I told him, I said, you be quiet now. I said, we're talking.
Yeah, and I think what I said was I think you'd probably agree with, for the most part, reading your opponent, I think is I think that could be applied to fencing. You're going to try to take advantage of whatever he's doing. It could be applied to what's that art? Fighting with the tatami, not tatami, but the oh shoot, what am I talking here? The bamboo swords and stuff. What's that?
Kendo.
Kendo. Yeah. So once again, you and sometimes you bait your opponent. I know I did that in judo. Mm-hmm. I was all the time. I let myself going to be swept. I loved it, and then they sweep me, and then during the air, I like to do reversals. So
yes. They
sweep me, and they think, "Oh, good, I got him," and then through the course of the throw, I reversed the throw in the center.
Exactly.
And I love doing that because that's very demoralizing. It's kind of like
absolutely.
It's kind of, I remember when Lonnie Coots, my first instructor, actually swept me, and I remember going down and I felt totally dominated and totally depressed. Not in a bad way. I didn't go want to kill myself.
No, I've been the same, and I agree with you.
But I hated being totally controlled by somebody else, and so that kind of led me to go, I want to learn how to do this. And so it was a lot of fun to do it. So when people did it, and I did everything from the typical takedown, the crossover takedown, to dragon whips its tail, where you drop down and do the reverse leg sweep,
iron broom sweep. Yeah, that's
the iron broom. Yeah, and it's very dangerous, and it's very hard because you have to hit hard with that leg. So when you come around with that that leg, you're actually, really slamming into him.
Oh, it
So
hurts. Yeah. And I
yeah,
like that
yeah.
kick too, that
Oh,
takedown.
yeah. Obviously I don't do it anymore, but it's it's I don't do anything anymore. So but
I was
it,
sparring.
it's
I was sparring with one of the Savat guys and Salim down at the academy, and he read me perfectly because I came in and I double kicked him, low high, and then I thought I'd fake him again and just go straight to the head and hook it. So as my foot came up, he dropped down and did that iron broom on me. I went on my butt so fast. He looked at me, he says, "You okay?" I said, "Yeah, that was a good one."
that
But yeah,
that
it's effective.
that's the perfect scenario for somebody that kicks high.
Yes.
And when you can read
Yes.
them, they're going to do a front crossover hook high. That's the thing where you drop down, and if you're fast at spinning around there and you get it right. The problem is some guys, when you do that, you have to keep your leg low to the ground. You
Yes.
gotta catch them right about at the ankle, and
Yes.
sometimes the kick goes way up high and it goes to calf,
Yeah.
or worse, even you go way too high. And that's usually the beginners. People that are really know how to do that usually let their foot sweep the floor, which is thus the iron broom. So you
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
sweep the floor. You don't raise your foot off the floor. It's not the iron uh, stick. It's the iron broom, which the broom sweeps the floor. And so, yeah, that's the thing there. So, but anyway, going back to reading your opponent, I think that's a
Yes.
real key and idea. I know it really helped me a lot because understanding motion, how to uh, how to do it. That's why I like forums, because
Hmm.
watching forums, when I watch myself in forums, I seem to get more in tune with myself. I see, because
I agree with that too, and that's the difference I see. With the JKD, with the whole Filipino arts. I mean, the curriculum is insurmountable. I mean, it's a ton of information coming like in the Filipino martial arts. I know we're not talking about that now, but people think it's just a weapon system. It's more than that. It's a complete system. Empty hand, healing arts. There's 12 areas that Inosanto teaches on it, which is amazing. But and even there, it's the read. In JKD, it's the read. In Salat, it's the read. I think any art at all, you coined it just right. And Planet says the same thing. He's always saying you need to read. If you can't read, you're going to have a tough time, and you're going to be reacting instead of, or excuse me, anticipating instead of reacting.
yeah, yeah, and I think I, I, I mean, one of the great flaws I think probably could apply to Jeet Kune Do as well as Kenpo. I'll apply it to Kenpo because that's obviously my focus at this point, and that's just the poor instructors that are out there.
Agreed.
And that probably could be across the board with any
Across the board,
system.
Dennis, you're 100% right. I've seen it. Down in the various areas I've gone to and explored, and been invited to. A lot of people state they're with a certain instructor. They had the picture taken, and probably get me in trouble saying that, but it's the truth. And
Hmm.
they become that so-called expert, and people follow that, and it's. I think there's a lack of, and there are a lot of good ones out there. There's a lack of extremely qualified instructors out there, and that's a little disheartening.
But and I think that's a problem, and particularly in an evolving art. And I'll use Kenpo as an example, as it developed from the late 50s through some of these instructors, these old guys, I consider them, I use the term aerolized. They grew up in a particular era
Hmm.
and they kind of stayed there and then they stopped
Hmm.
going because some guys worked in the 60s and they never took lessons in the 70s or 80s. And so they didn't get, quote unquote, some of the new ideas or developments or adjustments. And I'll give an example. Uh, the original rearrangement concept started where you could take a particular order, a particular technique, whatever it is, and you could do whatever it is, but you could also rearrange it and prefix it, suffix it, rearrange it, insert.
7 ingredients of a technique. I get it.
And so that rearrangement concept, which was the origin, turned into the equation formula. So it evolved to that. So then he actually formalized this thought process from merely saying the equation formula as itself. And that's what Tracy did, which is why I think they have like some 700 techniques or something. And the reason they did that was because they always had something to sell. You know, Mr. Parker said, nah, we're not going to do that. I'm going to trim the 32. I'm going to go from what originally was done back then, and I'm going to create this 32 system. And then from the 32, he wanted to go to 124 because he needed to go beyond green. And so he needed to go into the browns and blacks. So consequently, he created this 124 and, you know, went into that. And, you know, it was, I mean, I found it to be I feel very lucky to come up in the era that I came up in. But then again, I kept going through, I kind of journeyed into the 50s and 60s, not because I was there, because I wasn't, but I tried to sponge as many of those in that era as possible to try to get the picture of what was like back during that time. And so I got the idea of what some early classes were like, based on a variety of people from Joe Demick to Chuck Sullivan to what's his name, Dave Hebler, to, you know, to Huck, Uncle Huck, of course, you know, who just loves me. He thinks I'm the greatest.
You don't know. You're going to talk to him privately. I knew better. Okay, let me break it off there. The Love Fest is over with. Here we get back to it. So Bruce had the background of the Wing Chun style of studying with Yip Man, and then he also had the Western boxing, which he liked. I think it's interesting, in the philosophical side of it, he was referencing something of Lao Tzu with a quote that was used, and if you find in his book, I think it's either one of the quotes like 3 or 23 or something like that, because I was listening to that. But it's not at my fingertips, and that's irrelevant. The point is that the statement was made. He said, the quote was, moving, be like water. Still, be like a mirror. Respond like an echo. What an interesting antidote. Moving, be like water. Still, be like a mirror. Respond like an echo. I can see what he's doing. And you guys can correct me on this, but I'm the outsider. It looks like he is taking and he is referring to absorbing what he is and making what he can utilize for himself. I think that was the basis of a lot of Ed Parker as well, because he had his training. He could have actually just taught simply what he learned from Professor Chow: block, punch, kick, a few simple hand techniques, as they called them back in the day. And if you talk to any of our seniors, like, as you mentioned, Joe Demick, or maybe Chuck Sullivan or Dave Hebler, those individuals, James E. Brown's not here with us anymore, but I think they would refer to the simplistic statement of basics, foundation. I think Lee knew that, but he was always trying to refine it to keep it the most simplistic, direct response to the situation. I mean, if you got too flowery and whatnot, would that really work? Was that really true combat? I don't know. What do you think, Dennis?
I think too flowery gets too much into yourself. It doesn't interact with your opponent. You need to be able to utilize things that interact with your opponent effectively. And being flowery or too fancy typically doesn't do that. I think that's more you looking at you, or you reacting like you, or you doing things that are fun for you. It's not necessarily focusing on what's coming at you and what you can do effectively. You know, I think that Wing Chun, as an example, what I was saying earlier, works more on the center line stuff than a lot of your upper body, as Mr. Parker would put it, uppercase actions. Whereas when you start moving to fencing or boxing, now you start dealing with more depth and longevity. So there's a addition of two different perspectives there that need to be blended to be actually probably more useful.
We're going to go to Marty in a second, but there's a quote that I know that Dennis and I have talked about it. I know Marty knows about it because he has Kenpo background too. Out of range, in range, contact penetration, contact manipulation. Would you equate the Wing Chun to be more like in contact penetration or contact manipulation?
Compound question, Your Honor. It
Break it
has
down any
all
way
the,
you want, sir.
it has a little of everything. It does have the contact manipulation. It does have, when I say contact manipulation, it has that through the trapping and the movement that we utilize from that. It does have the penetration because you're consistently, trying to take away that person's structure by attacking their center line. And it's the old adage, if you can control their center line, you're going to, have the advantage in that situation. And you want to keep that advantage. And it's similar to the Kenpo, we have the cross and we have the X, and we utilize the X a lot more, like Dennis was alluding to earlier about the X, as Mr. Parker was stating it. Anything we can do in the Wing Chun, which would take away their, and I'm going to use the Kenpo terminology because that's what I know the best, along with the other, and we can relate to it. We take away their bracing angle by moving. If they have a cross pattern formulating towards us, we'll turn it to an X. A lot in the JKD will do the boxing adage into it, and some of the Wing Chun, because we'll be going around and bobbing, weaving, moving ourselves into position to get that better penetration and to have that ability to have that contact manipulation.
Dennis, do we utilize the trapping, or have we changed the trapping, or have our own response to the trapping?
I think trapping, I don't think we concentrate on that as much, obviously, but I know I personally do it because I like to cancel the opportunity for the other arm. And so I that's a form of trapping, to do that, or to collapse onto the person exactly when we block. The blocking hand is usually always on the outside of the other arm. We can at times come on the inside, but then you open yourself up to oppress and be trapped. But there are situations that do that, but we try not to do that. So we try to avoid the trap ourselves, and yet we try to look for others that allow us to trap. So I think it's a matter of, like I said earlier, talking to Marty, which is reading the opponent. If you can find the position of the opponent where you're able to trap them, that's a good thing for you to do. Now, as long as you don't fall into a trap where they're baiting you to come in, and that's where your real skilled practitioners, are, where they actually bait you to a false sense of security, and then they reverse it on you.
It's funny, as you say, do we actually call it trapping? Do we call it pinning?
I think trapping is probably used very, very little, and I think probably our term probably is more used. Pinning is obviously much more used than trapping, I'd say. I think it depends on the individual, though. So it really can be 6 of one, half dozen the other, tomato type thing.
I think it's interesting is that if you look at in the Wing Chun, it looks like most of the trapping techniques, drills, responses, Marty, are usually what we call upper body, with the arms and whatnot. Parker also introduced positional placement of our body so that we could, like a positional check. It's a check form. He'll use his knee to cancel out the use of your leg. Do you incorporate that in any of the JKD?
Well, to start with, the legs are utilized totally in JKD. We do checking with the legs. The kicks are used for blocking type motions, are used to intercept and, cancel. The legs are totally used. We call it trapping in the JKD. I agree with the statement that you're saying, it's the way I learned it in Kenpo is, pinning checks. We utilize that there to lock them off with the leg, with the hand, the positional checks, the hand checks, whatever is necessary at the time to stop that motion. The same applies to the JKD. I think where we don't do a lot of the locks and the trapping that we utilize in JKD, that way I don't see that a lot in Kenpo, where we have it more so, in the JKD.
And Dennis, I'm seeing. I'll bring this up, but I see in a comparison that actually what is Lee is doing is that he's taking what is useful, absorbing that, discarding the useless part, and then his answer is he's creating his own response based on what he believes is useful. So
I was thinking, thinking what Marty said, in terms of that. I think if you watch Bruce Lee and Enter the Dragon against Bob Wall, when they're doing the back fist scene, he was doing more contact penetration. He was going right from his check right into a back fist, and he was using speed and depth as his anchor. He wasn't trapping per se, like totally trapping the hand of the chest. He was positionally protecting himself with his lead arm that worked as a double factor. One as a strike, and the second was as a block for a counter from Bob Wall with that lead hand as well.
I think that's more of a cancellation. But Marty, what is that drill that he uses where the initial in your training in the JKD? I want to back up for a second. I know that in the Wing Chun, most of the training is straight on and whatnot. I think Bruce incorporated what Danny was using with the footwork and was changing his body position. So he was absorbing what he had from Wing Chun. He was taking what he had from Western boxing, and he incorporated that with also the Kenpo ideas. So this collectively becomes, absorbing what is necessary, discarding which is unnecessary, and making your own based on that. And that goes back to that principle of thoughts. One, come with a thought, be given a thought, create a new thought. I think that's one of the beauties of the JKD. So my question now is, in that opening scene that Dennis was mentioning about Bob Wall, where they're, hand to hand, crossing, and he does the trap, back knuckle, and then he has a bunch of counters to it. What actually is that drill called?
Well, we go into the drills and we just call them the Paksao, drills. I mean, what is it? It's a slapping type parry or hit, and we deflect off and in. We have a lot of the Chisao drills that we go into that would come from the Kung Fu, and we do a lot of that sidestep entry, and that would be from the Wing Chun, so they incorporate that from there. A lot of times with the parries, they're more of a slapping type parry as it deflects and goes in and to the strike. So it's exactly what Dennis was talking about. They don't waste any motion at all, or they don't waste any energy. They want the situation to be controlled and terminated as soon as possible. It's a 2-for-1. You're going to get a hit and then in. So, I mean, we call it a sophisticated basic, almost that, single motion, dual in purpose.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. When I was having my conversation with Louis Solis several weeks back, he used to refer to a term that he said Bruce said to him. He called it bridging. Bridging. Can you explain that concept there, Marty?
It's similar to conquering shield, like we're doing it. We're hitting and in. We're utilizing that strike and going in to get the next motion in place. So we get the height and the range that we need. In the JKD, Mr. Insano, would always tell us deflect off. You hit and deflect onto the next strike, and we do a lot of that in our training. So we don't minimize our strike or our energy as we're going in, so we can take care of two issues at once.
Dennis, what about your thoughts on that?
But yeah, I mean, to have a bridge, you have to have something that the bridge needs to go over. And so in this case, we're talking about an arm. And so, the question is, do you want to just go over the arm or you want to go through the arm? And I think pressing it and going through it is the most economical and most realistic. Now, in terms of Anasano striking it, that also depends on where your starting position is. If your
Correct.
starting position is not on the arm to start with, then you can actually strike it and press it or pin it or position it. As you continue that motion, don't stop at the block, or strike, you actually continue on through it, but you get 2 for 1. You strike the arm and then you strike the head or face, wherever you're going to with the other thing, but you're also protecting underneath, and forming your, as we would call it, the open end triangle. So we keep that movement trap so we don't get caught with something from the lower gate, or the lower, what do you call it? Lower case. We have uppercase and lower case, basically. So I think a lot of times I think we got an argument of semantics. A lot of times we got really the same base idea with very minor variation to it, but it's the same thing, pretty much.
I'm finding more similarities than differences here. Let's go to the
Agreed.
contrast comparison real quick with you, Marty. You call it Paksao, where they're using the motion, block, and strike. Tell me, what's the difference between, say, a double factor and what Marty is talking in the Paksao? Because you have the motion, if I can do it this way, where the rear hand is trapping as the front hand rotates and does the back knuckle strike. What's the difference of us doing the same thing with the double factor here?
I think basically intent, instead of just trapping and.
Is it the intent or is the execution?
Well, it's the intent of the execution. The thing is, one is just parrying the arm off and then striking, and the other one is, checking and then actually striking and moving in. I think it's just a minor technical difference.
Application, execution. Let's
pretty
get
much
Marty
the
would
same.
go in a JKD series response. Marty would have the hand would be there, and then that front hand would just snap right up and hit the guy right in the face. However, if the man checked it or blocked it, he could come back in with the backhand and then still hit that.
And he mentioned.
Am I wrong?
He mentioned conquering shield.
Okay.
So you're actually striking, and the technique doesn't, as written, doesn't really work this, but the way I teach it does. And that's where you don't just hit the arm, but you hit the arm and then you glance into the head, and strike the face.
Agreed.
The technique is just written as block the arm.
Yeah,
and
too simple.
And so the way I extend that arm is to get the 2 for 1 and go right into the face, and then that clouds for the opponent. It clouds the opponent for the rest of the technique that I'm going to do, because he's got hit in the face. And when you're hit in the face, it interrupts your brain focus, and so as a fighter, you're able to do more with less possible chance of retaliation, because they're trying to recover from what they just got hit with.
Totally
Marty,
agree. And
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and no, I love the way Dennis explained that, and also it gives you the ability, just to give you a similarity, as that arm came up and it clouds it. It also gives you the height to put down the elbow to collapse his arm, and that would take you into a lock after that. So I mean, that could be the start of that trap, and going into a controlled situation where we manipulate.
Well, right, the first move is a setup.
Yes.
Not only do you get a deflection into a strike, into a positional move, to where you're now playing pool, where you're taking your next shot, you're lining your next shot, to go down, and then continue on the sequence that you want to do. So again, like Mr. Parker's analogy to pool players, you're setting up your next shot with the way you're positioning. And that takes a fair amount of knowledge of positioning and reading,
Yes.
and taking advantage of what was originally posed to you. You interpret that scenario, and bang, 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 you're just react through training, which is where, and then we go back to the thing where you train to remember, you remember to forget, and you forget to become instinctive. So, as you're going through those phases of learning, now you're in a situation, and to do that trap, rebound, elbow again, claw type thing, you're continually positioning yourself without training to that, without repeating that thousands of times. Your brain's not going to recognize that scenario, and that's what we do with muscle memory and things like that, is to remember the scenario. So when you find yourself in a particular scenario or posture or position, this is what you can potentially do, and that's why we're training to not only focus on what we're doing, but also potential hazards on the edge, which is where our peripheral zones come in, where we start looking at peripheral, not only on the opponent that we're working on, but possibly another opponent coming in, a secondary opponent, or a third coming in from another angle. So we got to be focused on what we're doing at business at hand, but then also with what potentially is there. And also, after we're finished, where's the fastest exit out of here?
Absolutely. Position recognition is key. And we do a lot of that in the JKD also. We'll take it and we'll see a strike coming in, and this is, I believe my interpretation of it, the Inosanto method is to explore, discover, the different options there. But like you stated too, you have to be led there by a guide, which is your instructor, and giving you at least a pathway to follow. And I do like that. And I think that's where the self-expression starts coming into play down the road.
Yeah, once you've got a good quality education for yourself and how to
Yes.
move yourself and your body, and your body starts learning how to react, more or less. I know I've been in a situation where I was in one of my early tournaments. I was there, and there everybody tells you reverse punch. That's a big move. Well, all of a sudden, I did this block, and I wasn't thinking punch, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, my arm just goes out there and punches, and I'm going, "Hey, I didn't tell you to do that." I didn't focus on it, but my arm just reached out and punched, and I got a point, and I was actually kind of amazed, and I'm going, well, geez. And the only reason that could happen, as I analyzed later, is because we did so many punches in class. My arm just said, "Look, I know how to do this," and so it kind of took off on its own. It was,
You were watching Enter the Dragon. The punch just punched all by itself.
You see,
Mother-
I like that. I think, carrying it one step further though on that too, we know in that situation on how to react, but it goes back to your statement earlier, and I'm in total agreement with that. And I live by that too, try to, is the read. And you can't just depend on your next movement you have in your head. And my thoughts anyway, in your head, you have to take that energy that's coming at you, and it's got to go to that next position without having to fight that technique or chase after what you wanted. It may be what your opponent's going to be giving you that you need.
Oh, yeah, you have to blend activities. You got to blend responses.
Absolutely.
You have to blend your response with what action is coming at you, and then if done correctly, that's where your correct response comes from. But you do have to blend the activities.
A lot of people don't have that ability at times, and for whatever reason, to blend that and take that energy and move. I've been asked several times, to show me this technique, and then the strike or whatever's coming in changes, and the energy level changes, so your movement's going to change. And if you try to chase after that original thought process that you had you were going to show, it doesn't always come out true.
Well, yeah, you can't follow the original sequence of motion, because the sequence. Well, here's the thing: all the techniques are for, and this is a huge thing. The techniques are for a very specific type of attack. 5 swords, delayed sword, alternating maces, detour from doom. It doesn't matter what it is. The point is, they were written for a specific attack, and they were written in response, as the technique evolves, for a specific response from your opponent. obviously, in reality, when reality hits in, that doesn't always happen. Your opponent doesn't respond exactly as the technique does. And if you try to keep pushing the technique as written on a, like Paul said the other day, taking a round peg and putting it in a square position, it doesn't work. But you keep trying to force this technique, and all of a sudden things have changed. And I think that's exactly what you're saying is,
Yeah.
specifically is, you got to respond to what's there, not to what's written or what the training was. And that's where Bruce said, and I mean, my thoughts on the way what he meant was that's where you got to be free. You can't you can't be locked into the classical mess, because if you keep trying to push that technique as written in your curriculum in a situation, and the guy steps back with his left leg or changes position slightly or whatever, you have to be able to adapt continually. I liken it to like a ship on the ocean. If a squall pops up, the captain has to steer or maneuver the boat per what's coming at him with the ocean. He can't just turn sideways to a wave, otherwise he'll capsize. So, we have to be the same way. We can't just stick to that classical written word. That was for training. It was a drill to develop skills, as I say. That's all the material is, just drills to develop skills. But when you go to application, you then got to extract from those drills, you got to extract the skills per what comes at you. And that could be different from what's written.
No
This
doubt.
last in the last bit of our conversation here, in this first part, we'll keep on going. I'm finding this path, as Lee referred to it, the way is personalized, very much so. Parker was saying the same thing, but it gave you something to start with. Then you can figure it. With Bruce, I'm thinking what it is he had a foundation, but he realized he didn't want to limit himself to only what was being offered. And that was what we're seeing here. We're seeing an actually contrast of one that expanded upon a complete system, trying to bring the best that was available, and another that was coming and saying, I do not want to just fit into any of these square pegs. Okay, it's just not going to work for me. Okay, I have a round cylinder. So therefore, I will see what is available, and thus maybe I can make something that will be better for me because of his circumstances. Am I off base on that?
Well, kind of agreeing with you. No, you're right on, but kind of agreeing with you. And here we are at the buffet again, and you're at the Chinese buffet, but then right next to it is some Mexican buffet, and you go, oh, I only wanted Chinese in my original thought, but man, I look at those tamales over there, and I think I want a tamale as well. And so you add a side dish that, to your original factor, and I think that's exactly what you're saying.
We can change the metaphor, Marty, to something else, like sports cars would be great.
No, I like the sports cars, but I like the buffet too, and I totally agree on that. I like the ability to take, because what attributes that you personally have, and it's what we talked earlier. You can, and this is not from me, it's from Guru Dan. He stated that you can take all the lessons you want in basketball on the basketball court from a Kobe Bryant, or you can go to any different type, Tiger Woods for golfing, but you're not going to have their personal attributes. You have to explore and discover your own, because your swing could be different than theirs. Your shot could be different than theirs, and you have to learn who you are and what your self-expression is really going to be. And that's going to be ever evolving if you keep after it. And if you don't, then, it's what we talked earlier. The old regime is stuck there. And I do like the Inosanto philosophy. He's forever a student. He still takes lessons to this day, and he's 84, 85 years old now. Great role model.
I think you're brilliant, Marty. I think exactly what you're saying is brilliant. Tiger is Tiger, Kobe's Kobe, and God rest his soul. But the thing is, those guys were great current people, relatively new. What about the old golfers? The thing is, their swings were different, but they were not any less effective. They were just as effective. So Tiger's got his own swing, and he's very good today. But watching Jack Nicklaus, he had the same thing. The swing was different, maybe. I mean, it's basically a swing, but they might have a tweak here, tweak there, a twist here, a twist there, whatever. But the thing was, that doesn't mean they're any less effective. The point is
Correct.
being effective with whatever you have, and there's still a swing. A swing is a swing. That's what Bruce said. A punch is a punch, kick is a kick. But it's how you personally adapt it for yourself and institute it that's going to be the difference. It's still a swing. It's still a punch. There's no difference between Nicholas and Tiger. I mean, per se, it's still at the end of the day, it's the numbers and who wins. And so just in our case, it's more of who's being effective. The action might be slightly different. We're not all 5'2", and we're not 6'6". And so there's going to be a huge difference with body structure, size, weight, and sometimes ability. Some people just have more ability. They can practice all they want, and they just don't have or never will have the ability of Tiger Woods. In golf, I am the greatest hooker and slicer you've ever met.
I'm right with you. So
I cannot hit
You
the damn
charge
ball
by the
straight.
hour?
that was good, Paul.
Okay, I shouldn't have said hooker. Okay, I'm sorry. I should know better with Paul.
With Paul, yeah, you got to watch it.
But the thing is, it's that's just my point on that. And what's really fun here is then we get back to a lot of the root sayings like be fluid. Well, you got to be smooth with your action. There's nobody that's going to be robotic that's going to be very good. Mike Tyson, very fluid with what he does. Billy Blanks was very fluid with what he did. John Natividad, very fluid with what he did. Chuck Norris, Mike Stone, so they all of those guys had different styles and different fortes, Benny Urquidez, but they were all very committed, very smooth. They read, most of them, very well. And when they didn't read very well, they'd be the first usually to tell you, yeah, I screwed up. I didn't anticipate that move, or I didn't see it, or I didn't see it coming in some cases. And, they give credit where credit's due, where the other opponent just happened to have a sharper move on that particular move. Well, but that doesn't mean the next point, I could change that around and take it away. So.
I agree with that. A lot of times, we look at our movements and it's a study of motion. The bottom line, it doesn't matter what art you're in. You have to have the ability to study the motion. And I think within that thought process and starting to apply it, you look for the highest success ratio you can get out of that particular movement. I like the way Smiley Urquidez, one time we were talking about it. He says, in their world, his brother Arnold was their coach. And he says, getting in is the first, call of duty. He says, once you're in, he says, then the big question comes, what do you do then? And I think that's where you really need to see where you can, get that highest success ratio and effectiveness in your motions and your techniques to take care of the situation at hand.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to go to the end of this first part here, and we're just scratching the surface. I'm seeing so many similarities, and as choice of words, as Dennis was saying, you're splitting hairs here in some of this. I think the intent of what is being trying to be conveyed. You and I, and us collectively, us three, our primary language is English. I don't know what other languages you gentlemen speak. I've had some dabblings in others, but primarily I'm English when I speak. So a punch is still a punch. A kick is still a kick in the English language. But if you say that in German, or you say that in Japanese or Chinese, you speak in Spanish, how is it different? It's just the way it's being said, because I don't understand the language, but I understand what the meaning is. I do understand that much. Isn't that what we're seeing here? These great minds, these two men were amazing. Think about it. Cutting edge, ahead of the game, looking past traditional views and points of view, and not putting on blinders, saying that I am always true, I am always right. You have to be teachable, and they're showing us that. Am I off on that, Dennis?
Well, I appreciate the kudos. It's very nice of you. I think Marty and I are just speaking from the heart. We're just kind of free flowing. It's. I think I think to me, it's just today. Marty is my Ark Wong or my uh, Jimmy Wing Woo, or I know that's kind of a nasty name in some regards, but he was a brilliant man in a lot of ways. James Lee, Bruce Lee. So it's nice talking to somebody else who's very skilled. And most of the time, in my understanding, when Ed Parker went around, when he talked to people, it's refreshing to talk to somebody who kind of knows what's going on and are not constantly trying to be combative with you by saying my way is better, your way sucks. And it's nice when you get guys that are, I guess another way to put it is down to earth, maybe be a way to put it, or they're able to talk similarities and also differences without getting, offended and cranked around, even though there may be something you disagree on. Most of the time, I feel we agree on most. It may
Marty,
be said.
Marty, there, we're going right there. I would think I'm going to translate what Dennis just said in 3 minutes into the 15 seconds. Be efficient, be effective, be authentic.
Yes, and I agree with what Dennis said, and he's very kind in his words. Let it come from the heart. You have to be real, and I believe that in so many cases we get to the point where we get so much experience, we think we have to be the ultimate answer. And I always learn that from Mr. DeBounty. He said every time you go to a higher rank, he says you better know all the answers now, right? And he laughed. Well, I understand that statement now more than ever. And I'm not afraid to say I don't know, because, and I love the way Guru Dan Ansano states it. He says, no one person knows everything. He says, explore, discover, observe, ask questions, don't criticize, and you'll learn, and your martial arts journey will be fruitful.
I'm going to conclude this first part of a multi-series that we're going to do on Kenpo, American Kenpo and Jeet Kune Do. I'm going to quote first, as I said before, I reference books. This is the writings of a man, so therefore it is his words. I'm just repeating it. It's interesting because he says, Ed Parker quote in the Zen of Kenpo, he says, Kenpo. The Kenpo system is based on the outer limits of simplicity and the starting point of complexity. Bruce Lee. Now, these are words of his personal writings, but they came out after his passing. So these are his personal notes. And maybe he wanted people to know this, or maybe he did. Maybe these were reflections. But he said here, learning Jeet Kune Do is not a matter of seeking knowledge or accumulating stylized pattern, but is discovering the cause of ignorance. How enlightening from two men. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I really appreciate Dennis Conatser coming on here, Marty Zaninovich. Both of you are amazing individuals. Your wisdom is being shared with us through the knowledge of your life and experience in your journey of American Kenpo and Marty's case, Jeet Kune Do and related. And I thank you, and we'll continue this series as we go on to explore more of American Kenpo, Jeet Kune Do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Dennis.
Ditto. It's always a wonderful experience working with you, Marty.
Likewise. I really enjoy our conversation and our time spent together. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.